Hi folks, you're all very welcome back to 3 Minute Tales. I'm your storyteller, Shanna Key. Now, Happy New Year to you all. I have no idea where the months are going. We're now into 2020. Can you believe it? The months and years just fly by. The older you get, the quicker they go by. Anyway, since we're still in the festive season, I thought I'll bring you a little Christmas story. It's really all about exchanging gifts. When you get Christmas presents, sometimes, you hold on to them for a long time. Sometimes they're well discarded. But not in this case. Two individuals, two men on opposite sides of a war, meet on Christmas Day in no man's land on the Western Front in 1914. And roll on 100 years, those little two keepsakes that he gave to each other, they somehow become reconnected. It's an incredible tale. It's a bizarrely coincidental tale, but it's nonetheless very, very heartwarming. I hope you enjoy it. If you do, don't forget to give it a thumbs up. If you'd like to leave a comment, you can do so down below. And as I keep saying, if you haven't already subscribed to the channel, it doesn't cost you anything. All you have to do is press the little subscribe button beside 3 Minute Tales and happy days. And don't forget the little notification bell, because if you hit that, it means that every time we upload, you're notified. And happy days. So until the next time, thank you so much. I'm Shanna Key.
On the morning of October 6, 1914, 26-year-old father of three, Londoner George Butler, waved goodbye to his wife and children and joined his British Army colleagues to set sail for Europe to fight the invading German forces. 4 days later, he found himself in the Allied trenches on the outskirts of the French town of Arras. No more than 300 metres away, across a stretch of ground known as No Man's Land, were the German army, who were huddled together in their own trenches. Over the next 6 weeks, the sound of mortar shells and machine gun fire was incessant, with only the occasional lull in activity allowing both sides to rest and treat their wounded colleagues. However, even though the body count was steadily rising, morale was still high amongst the embattled troops. Soldiers on both sides of the divide sang triumphant songs in a battle of wits. Whenever the firefighting ceased, soldiers joked and jeered at each other across No Man's Land in a bid to keep their spirits high. As the weeks rolled by and the weather got colder, life in the trenches grew even more difficult for the soldiers. And as Christmas approached, thoughts of their loved ones back in Great Britain and Germany were foremost in the minds of the troops on both sides. On Christmas Eve night, the temperature plummeted to -6 degrees, and with a freezing fog hanging in the air, the atmosphere became eerily quiet. On Christmas morning, the guns fell completely silent, and as the mist began to clear, the British soldiers heard the German troops singing hymns and Christmas carols. The orders from the British officer in charge of the troops was to remain at their posts. But when a single German soldier could be seen climbing out of his trench, waving a white flag and walking into No Man's Land, the British soldiers reacted. One by one, British soldiers climbed out of their foxholes and approached the German soldier. Soon more German soldiers joined their comrade, and within 10 minutes over 200 troops were shaking hands and attempting to converse with each other. The spirit of Christmas seemed to be truly upon them all. George Butler lay down his gun and clambered over the brink of his trench before walking calmly towards the other troops. A tall, fresh-faced young German soldier held out his right hand. George shook it firmly and patted the young German on the shoulder. The German reached into his pocket and took out a silver cigarette case and offered George a cigarette. The two men happily smoked together in the freezing cold before the German held up a small photograph of a young woman holding a child. George knew instantly that this must be the soldier's wife and son. Tapping himself on the chest with his finger, he identified himself by saying his name loudly, Oscar Muller. George smiled broadly. He too pointed to himself and said, Butler, George Butler. The German smiled as George showed him a photograph of his wife and 3 children. Oscar put his finger to his lips and looked around furtively, before taking out a small hip flask from his jacket pocket. He offered it to George, urging him to drink from it. George put it up to his mouth and took a small sip of brandy from the flask. Both men laughed and shook each other's hands again. As a goodwill gesture, George removed a homemade necklace made from twine. Upon the twine hung a small hand-carved wooden cross that had been meant as a good luck charm for her husband. He offered it to Oscar, who took it in his hand. He nodded affectionately and opened the buttons of his own jacket. Around his neck hung a chain. It was made of silver, and it too had a cross hanging from it. He removed it and offered it to George, who accepted it and smiled broadly. Both men put on each other's good luck charms and laughed heartily. Before long, an impromptu game of soccer began, when a ball was produced by one of the British soldiers. Deciding to be onlookers rather than participants, Oscar and George stood side by side, smoking and sipping brandy as they watched the other troops play football together. After about an hour and a half of chatting, a command to return to the post could be heard from the trenches. Oscar and George embraced each other and wished each other well before they resumed their respective positions in their trenches. The two men were never to see each other again, but they both hoped and prayed for each other's safety. After being injured by shrapnel in August 1917, George Butler was honourably discharged from the army and sent home to recuperate. When the war finally ended, George wondered what had ever become of his friend Oscar. Had he survived the war and returned to his wife and son, or had he been killed like so many of his own colleagues? This was a question that he never got an answer to, but he kept the silver chain and cross and wore it proudly as a memento to their friendship. He often told the story of his brief liaison with his German adversary to his family and friends, and their tale became legendary amongst them. When George passed away in 1953, he left the silver chain and cross to his son Charlie. In respect to his father and his German opponent, Charlie wore it proudly and often regaled the story whenever asked about it. Charlie's own son Ronald eventually acquired it when Charlie died in 1990. Himself a soldier for some time, the story always resonated with him, and he too took to wearing the wartime memento. In the spring of 2002, Ronald Butler was on a hiking holiday in Austria with a close friend and his two sons, Harry and James. After a long day hill walking on the foothills of the Alps, Ronald suddenly complained of feeling unwell. Within minutes, 54-year-old Ronald collapsed, suffering from a massive cardiac arrest. His two sons and their friend immediately phoned for help as they frantically attempted to keep Ronald alive. Purely by coincidence, a nearby rescue helicopter was on a training exercise and was close enough to be redirected to where this stricken hill walker lay. By the time the rescue helicopter landed, Ronald had stopped breathing and had no visible pulse. The chopper's medic, Dr. Eric Schultz, was first on the scene, where he immediately began to resuscitate Ronald. It took a full 7 minutes of CPR before the medic eventually detected a pulse, much to the relief of Ronald's sons. But he wasn't out of the woods just yet. The four men were airlifted to the nearest hospital before a critically ill Ronald was put on a life support machine. He remained in intensive care for a further 6 days before being released from hospital. When being discharged, Ronald's sons again bumped into the medic, Eric Schultz, in the lobby of the hospital. As they made small talk, the medic explained that their father was a very lucky man. James Butler laughed and said that their father would no doubt put his good fortune down to his lucky keepsake. James explained the story behind Ronald's chain and cross and how he'd come to inherit it from his father before him. As Ronald's sons laughed dismissively, a quizzical look appeared on the face of Eric Schultz. He'd heard this story before. "What is your family name?" asked the medic. When James said the name Butler, the medic shook his head in disbelief. He put his hand into his jacket pocket and took out a leather pouch. He opened it and took out a small hand-carved wooden cross that his own grandfather had given him many years ago to keep him safe. His grandfather was none other than the son of Oscar Muller.